Ah, the Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth. Best fantasy world to ever be created by one of the greatest minds in recent history. And I am completely biased on the matter, there is no doubt about that. And if you disagree, then fight me. On the tabletop game, of course. Here's my army. With all its different factions and creatures and characters, one in particular I'll be covering in this video. You might know him either by reading the title of the video or by his smoldering good looks in the picture presented before your eyes. In any case, this is the story of the smoothest operators to ever walk the face of the earth, and with the help of words on digital paper, I hope to shed light on some of the silly deeds this otherworldly goober has done. Sauron, or as he was known at the time, Myron, was the most powerful Maya of the Vala Aule the Smith. And under Aule's teaching he became a great craftsman, and between you and me, Myron was the most powerful Maya overall. Now in the days before days, since Myron, like all other beings, was a creation of Eru Iluvatar, and thus was good and noble. However, Myron had virtues of order and perfection, and disliked anything wasteful, and I am sure that will have no major consequences down the line. And one fateful day, Myron would find a particular Vala that seemed to be able to help him on his path towards perfection and order. This Vala was Melkor. This would ultimately lead to Myron's downfall and betrayal of the other Valar, and fall to the dark side of the Force. And soon after pledging his service to Melkor, he made Myron his second in command, and like a wise man once said, teamwork makes the dream work. Although Sauron had some parts to play during the First Age, he and his shenanigans doesn't really come into full effect until the Second and Third Age, when he fully could step out from under his master's shadow and fully commit to his goal of domination. Since Melkor's end goal differs from Sauron in that Melkor wanted to destroy Middle-earth, whereas Sauron wanted to control it and everyone in it, for their own benefit of course. And if that doesn't scream narcissism, I do not know what will. Now to his credit, Sauron, or well Myron during this time, was basically a demigod with powers mere mortals couldn't even comprehend. Let us ponder for a short spell, just a wee moment. If you had powers of basically a god, would you not feel a little bit more powerful and fit to rule than your average Joe? Let's be real. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you have to become evil. Unless. Anyway, back to Sauron and his plans of eventual domination and control, and where best to start than the First Age. Sauron's first big no-no moment, besides siding with the first Dark Lord, was when he did aid Melkor in his foul sorcery in the creation of the Orcs, in mockery of Eru's fair and noble elves. Now the Valar wasn't the biggest fans of the shenanigans Melkor and Sauron were up to, and so they waged war against them, which is known as the Battle of the Powers, during which Sauron did his first funny moment and feigned resistance at Angband, one of the fortresses of Melkor, which distracted the Valar and allowed Melkor to assemble his forces at Utumno, the other lovely fortress. However, they were ultimately defeated and both of the fortresses were sacked. Melkor was then captured, unlike Sauron, who sneakily eluded the Valar and later took control, if you will, in his master's absence. When Melkor eventually returned with the Silmarils, not legally acquired, he was pursued by a race of elves known as the Noldor, from whom the Silmarils was stolen. They were quite upset about their precious stones being stolen, and so they too waged war against Melkor. Sauron during this war was counted as the greatest of servants, and had shown to have powers of shape-shifting and sorcery. More about that later. Much later, when the first men awoke far in the east, and Melkor left to do his usual business of corruption and other good doing, Sauron was left to his own devices and directed his attention to the elves, and specifically the Isle of Tul Sirion. Commanding a host of Balrogs, allegedly, he seized the island from its current warden, Orodreth, and like a landlord when you are late for rent, just evicted him. And just to rub some salt in the wound, not only did he kick the elves out, using the term kick lightly here, he also renamed the island to Tol in Gauroth, the Isle of Werewolves, where he also established himself as Lord of Werewolves. Keeping with the themes here, are we? In 456 of the First Age, after the Dagor Bragola, the Battle of Sudden Flame, Sauron was tasked with destroying Barahir, an ally of Finrod, the king of Nargothrond, during the battle. He did not manage to find Barahir at first. However, his hunter did catch a member of Barahir's company known as Gorlim. Now, Gorlim, when interrogated, was a hard nut to crack and was not willing to give up his comrades even under torture. And not until Mr. Gigachad Sauron stepped forward, having grown tired of constant resistance from the man, bartered with Gorlim and found out that what he wanted more than anything was to know the fate of his wife, Eliniel, whom he thought had been captured. Sauron then promised to reunite the two of them if he revealed where Barahir was hiding. Gorlim then yielded to Sauron and gave up his companion's whereabouts to Sauron. Sauron then, like an absolute scoundrel, revealed that his wife was dead and put Gorlim to death afterward, reuniting them, if you will, in the afterlife. Sauron then sent his servants to slay Barahir's company, in which they were successful in doing. His son Beren, who rolled a nat 20, and managed to evade such a fate. Beren, who would later come across Sauron's path once more during his quest for the Silmaril, in order to win the favor of Thingol, king of Doriath, for his daughter Lúthien's hand in marriage, where Beren and Finrod tried to sneak past Tulin Gauroth disguised as orcs. Now this plan would have worked had it not been that Sauron himself watched over the island, and now Sauron, being the evil genius that he is, had ordered all orcs who passes through to report to him, and since Beren would have no idea this was the case, made Sauron scratch his chin in suspicion, and had them brought before him in order to question them about their business, since he suspected there was foul play at work. Sauron, being the Ozzy Osbourne of Middle-earth, then defeated Finrod in a duel with Songs of Power, stripping them of their stolen garb and cast them into the dungeons. Soon afterward, Lúthien and Huan the Wolfhound came to Tulin Gauroth in search of Beren and company, where Sauron hoped to have his servants once again capture the intruders. But Huan got that dog in him and managed to slay all of them, including Drauglin, father of all werewolves. Now Sauron was aware of the prophecy Huan could not be slain save by the greatest wolf that ever lived. As it were, Sauron thought he did the power move and transformed himself into a great werewolf and charged down towards Lúthien. Now Lúthien, being an absolute unit, had her sorcery silliness maxed out and cast a sleeping spell on Sauron, who became momentarily impacted by her spell. And that's enough for me, Huan thought, then seized the initiative and rose to the occasion and leapt upon Sauron with all his might. And Huan managed to subdue Sauron, who in all his shape-shifting power tried to escape in form of a serpent, but to no avail. Lúthien, knowing Sauron to have gathered much power in his corporeal form, gave him a choice. Either lose his corporeal form and return to Melkor powerless and in shame, or surrender the island to her and flee. Sauron chose the latter, and fled in the form of a vampire. After his defeat by Lúthien and Huan, Sauron played little part in the coming events in the First Age. When Melkor was defeated, he approached the host of the West and pled for mercy. However, Eonwe, leader of the Western host, did not have the authority to pardon a being such as Sauron, Eonwë told Sauron to go to Aman and be judged by the Valar. Sauron did, if you can believe it, not return to be judged. Instead, he fled to Middle-earth to hide. Now then, this is where Sauron really picks it up a notch. After fleeing during his master's defeat in the First Age, Sauron remained hidden for a moderate amount of time, about 5 centuries or so. Slowly but surely, however, he began to feel some major main character vibes now that he felt that the Valar, including his master Melkor, had failed. That this was the beginning of his own villain arc. By the year 1000 of the Second Age, had he managed to gather and establish himself in Mordor, and began the construction of his own dread fortress, Barad-dûr. He grew his forces by gathering all the orcs that had been scattered far and wide in the northern parts of Middle-earth, as well as trolls and other creatures from the time of Melkor. Sauron also gained the allegiance of the Easterlings, long corrupted by Melkor, and the Haradrim of the south. Sauron, however, desired more powerful followers than men, so he turned his attention to the elves, since they were more powerful than any man, except the men of Númenor. And we'll talk more about them later, believe that. So after about 500 years of pondering his orb and aura farming, deciding how best to deceive the elves, he put on a fair visage and took the name Anatar, Lord of Gifts. His guise was that of an emissary of the Valar, which is ironic, since the Valar would much later send emissaries known as the Istari to aid the people of Middle-earth against the darkness. Whether Sauron was playing 5D chess and knew of this, or if it's just blind luck, is unclear. And so with his new form he travelled to Lindon, where he tried his luck to befriend Lady Galadriel, Elrond and Gil-galad. They were however not swayed by his fair guise, sensing that some tomfoolery was afoot, and did not trust Anatar and turned him away. Now I do not know how you can say no to this absolute beauty of a man. Maybe they felt like if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Sauron, of course, did not take this lightly, but could do little at this moment. He then turned his attention to the elven smiths of Eregion. Maybe they would be more easily convinced, just as their ancestors gave themselves to the teachings of Melkor. But maybe they would give themselves to the teachings of Sauron. And so, with a spring in his step and a fire in his belly, he set out towards Eregion, believing this time would be different. When he arrived, Sauron began working his silver tongue, and the naive and foolish smith were no match for such a power move, and so they began to heed his wisdom and cunning regarding crafting and metallurgy without even a shadow of a doubt of any strings attached. Even the great Celebrimbor, who is a right descendant of Feanor himself, the Elf Lord, created the Silmarils. After some time in Eregion, when he felt that the elves were eating straight out of the palm of his hand, granted them the knowledge and encouragement to craft magic rings. He then rolled a nat 20 on stealth and infused the rings with potent spells, while also forging the One Ring in secret in Mordor. With the One Ring complete, he felt that now was his time to shine and step up to the plate as God King and put on his ring. The elves, sensing that some trickery and treachery was afoot, removed and hid their rings with haste. Sauron then prepared 90 years for open war, gathering all forces that he could, and then set out for the classic world domination evil guy plan. When he arrived in Eregion in search for the magic rings, he could only get his hands on 16, 7 for the dwarves and 9 for men, which he distributed accordingly. However, the dwarves, being the short kings that they are, proved too stubborn and hardy to fall victim to such paltry corruption as turning to the dark side. Not even when Sauron was wearing his own ring, Men, however, were more easily driven by ambition, and drawn to power was not so lucky, and everyone that received a ring from Sauron fell into his service, eventually turning into the dreaded Nazgul. Having conquered nearly all of Middle-earth, Sauron had effectively grown greater than his former master, and only Gil-galad's realm of Lindon stood between Sauron and total victory. And he would have had this victory if it weren't for them pesky Númenóreans, who clearly violated some rule of engagement and just showed up to help the elves. Now these men were different since they are descendants of Elros, which made them greater in stature and spirit than those of Middle-earth mainland. And with the assistance of Tar Minastir, the current king of Númenor, the elves and men beat Sauron back at the Battle of the Gwathlo. Sauron then fled with his bodyguard to Mordor to scheme once more for a moderate amount of time, as you do when you are basically an immortal demigod. Towards the end of the Second Age, Sauron had once again aura found enough to raise large and powerful armies to go and dip his toes in the water for world domination once more. And so he claimed the titles Lord of the Earth and King of Men. And again conquered almost all of Middle-earth, but he made a small blunder, a tactical error, a little overconfident mistake. And as we all know, overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer. He harassed a number of Númenórean settlements along the western coast, which caught the eye of Ar-Pharazôn, the most powerful king of Númenor the world has yet seen. Now, Ar-Pharazôn was a tiny bit power-hungry, just a bit. And so Sauron laying claim to the title as King of all men didn't really sit well with him, as he himself, of course, should bear such a title. And so he did what any sane ruler would do and set off to challenge Sauron and force him to swear fealty. Now Ar-Pharazôn, being the absolute unit that he is, mustered a force so large it made Sauron's army look like if you were to compare the Astra Militarum to a regular army. He then set off towards Umbar and later began to march towards Mordor. When he arrived, Sauron's army basically noped out of the situation and left Sauron to deal with this problem. And so, being the evil genius he is, Sauron saw how the cards unfolded and decided he could not beat the Númenóreans by force, and thus he surrendered to Ar-Pharazôn's messages. He then assumed his fair form once more and descended Barad-dûr and approached the Númenórean king and began working the famous silver tongue of his, trying to charm the king with his appearance, mannerism and flattery. Basically, he tried to rizz up the king. The Númenóreans were rather confounded by this, since they believed Sauron to be anything but what was now being presented. However, Ar-Pharazôn was not as impressed as his generals, and thus demanded Sauron return with him to Númenor as a hostage. Sauron feigned unhappiness at this request, but in secret was rubbing his hands together at his opportunity to destroy Númenor from within. And so he set to work immediately. After only a few years in Númenor, he went from prisoner to chief advisor to the king, weaving his silver tongue and using the Númenorian sphere of mortality to every advantage possible. Not only did he have the king eating out of his hand, almost all of the king's court fawned over Sauron. And who could blame them? Have you seen this guy? He radiates aura. Sauron made them believe that Morgoth had the power to save them from death, and had the Númenóreans raise a great temple in his name, where they performed human sacrifices to the Dark Lord. He then, as his ultimate move, convinced Ar-Pharazôn to attack Valinor and the Valar, and claim it for himself. But then something happened that not even Sauron could have predicted. With all of his shenanigans and scheming in Númenor, it caught the eye of Eru Ilúvatar, God himself, if you will. And this final push to attack Valinor made it so that Eru himself intervened and drowned the Isle of Númenor, and in doing so, Sauron's physical form was destroyed, but not his spirit. And carrying the One Ring with him, he fled back to Mordor, where he once more began to rebuild his body and strength. However, after recent events that transpired with Numenor, a patch dropped, and Sauron got a bit of a nerf, and could no longer take his handsome male-looking form, and decided to lean into sheer terror and force with his rule. After the drowning of Numenor, Sauron felt rather pleased with himself. And rightfully so. He'd removed a major thorn in his side and heavily crippling the forces of the West, leaving the elves to basically stand alone. Or at least so he thought. However, one faction, known as the Faithful, led by an especially rude, in Sauron's opinion, a Numenorian known as Elendil, had survived the collapse of the island. Now, Elendil didn't really like his home island being completely and utterly destroyed, so he also decided to pull a kind of a Uno reverse card on Sauron and established two kingdoms in Middle-earth. Arnor in the northwest, and Gondor in the south, right on Sauron's doorstep. Sauron, not being the most fond of this development, made war against Arnor and Gondor. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, had not been idle, however. While Sauron vacated Numenor, he'd built up his forces significantly in the inevitable return of Sauron. Sauron, in his haste to prevent Elendil from strengthening his position, alerted Gil-galad of his return, before his own forces were fully prepared. A classic power move with no dire consequences down the line. Gil-galad, now aware of Sauron's return, allied with Elendil, and together they formed the famous Last Alliance and marched against Sauron. At the Battle of the Dagorlad, they defeated Sauron's armies and laid siege to Barad-dûr for 7 long gruesome years. When Sauron finally showed himself, he did the gentleman deed and dueled both of the High Kings, and like a boss, managed to slay them both, shattering Elendil's sword Narsil in the process. However, his victory would be short-lived, as Sauron himself, badly wounded, was not able to stop Isildur, Elendil's son, from cutting the One Ring from his finger with the broken Narsil. In this moment, Sauron's physical body was destroyed, but his spirit endured once more and fled. And at last we reach the Third Age, the one we all know and love. Having his plans thwarted once again by these free people of Middle-earth and his physical body destroyed again, Sauron had to accumulate his strength again for a moderate amount of time, and in 1000 of the Third Age he crawled back into Middle-earth and began doing some small mischievous deeds. And about 1050 of the Third Age took residence at the Hill of Sorcery, or more commonly known, Dol Guldur, in southern Mirkwood. Now Sauron at this time, being quite weak compared to what he used to be, he took a title as the Necromancer and started working in secret, spreading malice and evilishness from the old fortress. And quite successfully so. The elf did not discern that it was the Dark Lord returned, so they paid little attention to the matter. Around the same time, the Valar sent the famous Istari, or wizards, as they would be referred to by the people of Middle-earth, in order to counter Sauron's potential re-emergence. Sauron, being the absolute Sigma that he is, kinda dismissed their presence as a weak show of force by the West. Continuing his scheming and gathering of strength in Dol Guldur, his most deadliest servants, the Nazgûl, reappeared in 1300 of the Third Age and began steadily assaulting the Númenórean kingdoms at Sauron's behest. One of the 9 being very successful in this would be the Witch King of Angmar, since his war against the Northern Kingdom ended in its destruction. Gondor, while not being utterly destroyed, was gravely weakened for various reasons like war, plague, infighting, and constant coastal raids by the corsairs of Umbar. In the same period, Sauron's ore farming began stirring the northern orcs of the Misty Mountains, and they began to grow more bold in their incursions and barring the passes between Eriador in the west and the Vales of Anduin to the east. Dragons began emerging as well, laying waste to the dwarven mansions and consuming 3 of the 7 dwarf rings. Sauron also had his influence over the Easterlings and other wicked men, and guided by his emissaries, they began assaulting the Gondorians and Northmen in the west. Middle-earth piqued the suspicion of one particular wizard, and to confirm if Sauron had indeed returned, Gandalf infiltrated Dol Guldur in 2063 of the Third Age. However, Sauron, not feeling like revealing his position yet, did the only sensible choice and skedaddled eastward, to a place where he felt more welcome for the time being. This marked the beginning of the so-called Watchful Peace, which ended about 400 years later in 2460. When Sauron returned to Dol Guldur after this moderately long training montage, this was the same year that the store hobbit Smeagol, later known as Gollum, and Deagol found the One Ring in the Anduin River. Coincidence? Maybe. Following the sack of Erebor by the dragon Smaug, Sauron felt there might be a chance to take advantage of Middle-earth's weakened state, since Arnor was no more, leaving Rivendell and Lothlorien open to attack. Gandalf, being quite the orb ponderer, had come to the same conclusion, however, and he feared that Sauron would seek an alliance with Smaug. And so Gandalf did the only sensible thing and once more ventured into Dol Guldur to put an end to the question about this necromancer's true identity. And to no one's surprise, it turned out to be Sauron himself. And so in the year 2941 of the Third Age, the White Council attacked Dol Guldur and ousted Sauron before he and Smaug could help one another. Sauron, however, who had plenty of time to prepare for this assault, and being the evil genius he is, did, as he has done in the past, feigned retreat to appear weaker than he actually was, and returned to Mordor, where in 2951 of the Third Age, he would openly declare himself, and began preparation for his final war to dominate all of Middle-earth. Smaug, however, would not be part of this, because shortly after his defeat at Dol Guldur, Smaug would be killed by Bard the First, eliminating a most powerful and potential ally of the Dark Lord. Now, back on his home turf, Sauron wasted no time in increasing his strength and started by breeding immense armies of orcs and called up his old buddies from the east, the thematically named Easterlings and Variags, and the Haradrim from the south, plus a little extra help from the Corsairs of Umbar. Now these factions alone are a force to be reckoned with, but none compare to the Nine. The Witch King being first in command and leader of the forces pushing westward, he sent Khamûl the Easterling, second greatest of the Nazgul, to resettle Dol Guldur and prepare it for war against Thranduil's realm in Mirkwood, and Sauron, being a thematic entity, once again adopted the lidless eye as his symbol. With the gathering of his forces in full effect, he set to work on his war plans against the Men of the West and started by influencing the current steward of Gondor, Denethor II, with the use of a Palantir, great and powerful relics brought by Elendil when Numenor was drowned by Eru in the Second Age, known as the Seeing Stones. There were 7 Seeing Stones when Elendil brought them with him, but during the current times only a few remain in play. The Anor Stone, held in Minas Tirith, and the Ithil Stone, stolen by Sauron when the Nazgul took over Minas Morgul, formerly known as Minas Ithil. Sauron, being what he is, used his massive brain power to convince the steward of his inevitable defeat, and Denethor, being strongly willed for a human, is still only human, and not being a high enough level wizard, did not possess the ability to cast Intellect Fortress on himself, and slowly succumbed to despair. Having worked his magic on Gondor, he set his vision on Gondor's neighboring ally Rohan, and reached out to the wizard Saruman, who also had a seeing stone in his possession, known as the Orthanc Stone, and compelled him to betray the White Council and serve him with the sweet promises of power and rich reward. Now, Saruman, being a little bit, just a teeny tiny bit power hungry, did not really want to bend the knee to Sauron immediately, since he himself also coveted the One Ring and thought he could pull a feigned allegiance. Sauron, however, saw through this illusion, since he could read Saruman's thoughts even when he tried to withhold information. Sauron is just him. There is no other way around it. Now, since Sauron's life force is bound to the One Ring, and until he has it returned to him, he is unable to take physical form, which kinda demoted him to cam duty, sitting in his tower, watching his servants do his bidding. And I would imagine his priority list, if he had one, to be rather short, and it would probably look something like: Step 1, find the One Ring. Step 2, world domination. Simple and easy to remember. And so he dispersed his servants in search for whatever leads they could find in the One Ring's whereabouts. And so they found the creature known as Gollum and brought him back to Mordor, where Sauron had him tortured and learned that he had had a magic ring in his possession, and heard the words Shire and Baggins. And that was apparently enough for Sauron, since he basically pulled a Darth Vader, where in The Empire Strikes Back they scout the Hoth system and they see a power generator and Vader saying, "That's it, the rebels are there." And so he released Gollum in 3017 of the Third Age, hoping that he would unwittingly lead him to Baggins. However, Gollum's trail was lost in the dead marshes, where Sauron's emissaries could or would not follow him. Not really the news one would like to hear. Like, what would that conversation have sounded like? Like, "My lord, we could, and some of us would not follow the creature into the marshes for reasons." Now, I know it is a foul and evil place that spreads with every year since the battle, but really, will you accept that excuse as the epitome of evil? Anyway, I digress. And so Gollum's trail was lost. Later, Sauron got news that Gollum had been captured by his enemies, and upon learning this, he dispatched the Nazgul in search for the Shire and to find this Baggins. And to combine two birds with one stone, he also tested the strength of Denethor's Gondor by assaulting Osgiliath, in order to conceal the Nazgul on their mission. At the same time, his servants in Dol Guldur launched an attack on Thranduil's realm, where Gollum was currently held, with orders to either capture or kill. Gollum, however, is a slippery creature and escaped both Sauron's servants and his enemies. The Nazgul eventually found their way to the Shire and at Weathertop came close to capturing Baggins. They ultimately failed, otherwise this would have been a rather short part, and thus returned to their master empty-handed. Sauron then sent out a orc warband led by the easily pronounced named orc Grishnak to join forces with a group of Isengarders that was tracking the Fellowship of the Ring. After the ambush at Amon Hen, the orcs and Uruk-hai managed to capture two hobbits and set off towards Isengard, but due to Saruman being a wee bit power-hungry and disloyal, they were slowed down with internal strife and later slain on the eaves of Fangorn by the Rohirrim. After this major setback, Saruman found himself in a bit of a pickle, not only having lost the chance to get the One Ring, at least to his knowledge, also found himself having cheated his master Sauron, and in a final attempt to amend this massive blunder, Saruman launched an all-out assault against Rohan, and sent his army to attack Theoden, king of Rohan, at Helm's Deep. Now, the Battle of Helm's Deep is one of, if not the best night battle ever to be brought to the big screen, and I strongly suggest you rewatch the trilogy just because, let's be real, the Lord of the Rings will never be topped anyway. Saruman was eventually defeated at Helm's Deep by the Rohirrim and the Ents, which made Sauron lose one of his most powerful vassals and Isengard's army. A short time after Saruman's defeat, a particular fool of a Took had the brilliant idea of looking into the recovered Orthanc stone that Saruman had in his possession, and by pure chance got on a call with Sauron. At first, Sauron was fooled by this facade and believed him to be a servant and reprimanded him for not reporting on recent events. He soon, however, realized that the surveyor was a hobbit and then assumed that Pippin was Saruman's prisoner, and thus he tried to coerce information from him. And this is where the turntables really do a flippity-flop, because from the sidelines, the pinnacle of masculinity steps forward and reached out his hand and grabbed the palantir from young Pippin, and thus Aragorn revealed himself to Sauron. And seeing the heir of Isildur, Sauron concluded that his not-so-loyal vassal had fallen, and that Aragorn possessed the One Ring. Fearing that his enemies would use the ring against him, Sauron went into a little bit of a panic and sped up his plans to attack Gondor, specifically the city of Minas Tirith, seeking to raze it to the ground and crush the last human resistance before it could be fortified and the men of the West unite under one king. Even though Sauron moved quicker than expected, his army was defeated due to the combined efforts of Gondor, Rohan, and the Dunedain of Arnor. Now, after his defeat, a previous overconfident Sauron began to feel a very human chill down his demigod-like spine. Doubt began to gnaw at him, even though his remaining military strength was enough to destroy Minas Tirith and easily conquer Middle-earth, and so he sat back and waited and watched, hoping that there would be some internal strife between Aragorn and the other potential Ring Lords, in which he then could seize the advantage once more and move out to claim the ring for himself. Now, of course, we know that Aragorn and company did not possess the ring, which gave them precious time to consider their options. Despite his defeat, the victorious Western force knew that Sauron had the bulk of his forces in Mordor, readying themselves for round 2 of world domination, with an even larger force than last time, were he to attack. With the knowledge that Mordor being as filled as it is with Sauron's forces, they knew that Frodo almost stood no chance of crossing the plains of Gorgoroth without being captured. And so Aragorn called for a council with the major commanders, and he also appointed our favorite inquisitive and based wizard, Gandalf, as their commander until the crisis had passed. Gandalf wasted no time beating around the bush and presented them with 2 options. They had 1, either wait for another attack and hope hobbits really are light on their feet and can pass unseen by most, or 2, gather their full strength and march on the Black Gate in order to draw out Sauron's forces and empty his land. And as a certain dwarf would say, certainty of death, small chance of success. What are we waiting for? Now, this force would only have to be large enough to offer battle, and the rest would garrison Minas Tirith. Now, this plan would hopefully make it easier for Frodo, since Sauron's gaze would not scan his own land and instead be fixed upon the now challenging force, since the strength of this army would not be enough to pose a real threat to him. And maybe Sauron would believe that the leader of this army would have been influenced by the ring and be filled with overconfidence with his newfound power. And like a moth to a flame, Sauron marshaled most of his remaining forces and marched them towards Udun with a clear purpose to destroy the force of the West and regain his precious ring. Now, having fallen for this cunning plan, left most of the plains of Gorgoroth empty, which lowered the difficulty from like an 11 out of 10 down to maybe a 4 or a 5 for Frodo and Sam to reach Mount Doom undetected. And after reaching the cracks of Doom, there was a surprise wisdom check which Frodo failed, and at this crucial moment in time succumbed to the power of the One Ring and put it on. This immediately alerted Sauron that he had fallen victim to what we like to call a classic blunder. And so he turned his gaze towards the mountain and in a large ditch, frantic effort, sent his already deployed Nazgul to do a 180 and retrieve the One Ring, but was inevitably too late as Gollum, after taking the ring, consensually of course, from Frodo, slipped and fell into the cracks of doom. The One Ring was unmade alongside with Gollum, and the earth shook as a shockwave rippled across Mordor, and our favorite fortress of dread, Baradur-'s foundation, was destroyed, causing it to finally fall into ruin once and for all. And the remaining Nazgul was destroyed in the eruption of Mount Doom. Now, with the source of his power gone, this was when Sauron was utterly defeated, and the remnants of his armies were bereft of the main driving force behind their conquest, and so they were swallowed up by the earth and destroyed. The One Ring's destruction also caused Sauron to be permanently robbed of his physical form and reducing him to an evil spirit that hovered above Mordor, quote, "Huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning crowned, terrible but impotent, only to be blown away by a great wind." Even though Sauron could never truly be completely destroyed because of what he is, his mind is forever bound to Ea. He had lost all power to effect his will upon the world, and could never again interfere with Middle-earth. If you enjoyed my take on this beautiful yet dangerous Maya we all know and love, leave a like, and if not, then I thank you for your time anyway. If I missed something, let me know in the comments below. Fansai Guy, signing off.